The laughter started at the family barbecue on a Sunday afternoon in late June. The kind of forced gathering where everyone pretends things are normal while tension sits thick in the air like humidity before a storm. And I was standing near the picnic table with a paper plate in my hand, watching my nephew chase fireflies across the lawn while trying to avoid conversation with my sister Natalie, who was holding court by the grill, talking about her recent kitchen renovation. My mother Donna was showing photos on her phone to anyone who would look, swiping through images of Natalie's house with its wraparound porch and professionally landscaped gardens, and that expensive pergola they'd just installed over the back patio. And I could hear her voice getting louder with each compliment she received, feeding off the attention the way she always did when Natalie's accomplishments were the subject of discussion. I'd been hoping to get through the afternoon without incident. Maybe grab a burger and leave early, claiming I had work in the morning, which was true since I worked retail on Sundays. But my mother had other plans because she suddenly turned toward me with that smile she gets when she's about to say something she thinks is funny, but really isn't. The corners of her mouth tight and her eyes too bright with a kind of gleeful meanness I'd seen directed at me my whole life. She held up her phone, showing Natalie's house in all its glory, and said loud enough for everyone in the yard to hear. Every aunt and uncle and cousin and neighbor who'd been invited, "Kara, you'll never have a house like your sister's." And the words landed in the sudden quiet like stones dropping into still water. My father Harold chuckled from his lawn chair, where he'd been nursing the same beer for an hour, not even looking up from the sports section of the newspaper he'd brought outside. Like my mother's comment was the most obvious truth in the world, and barely worth acknowledging. Just a statement of fact about the natural order of our family hierarchy. Natalie stood near the grill with her husband Austin, both of them dressed in expensive casual clothes that screamed country club, even though we were just in my parents' backyard. And she smiled too when she heard what Mom said, that small, satisfied smile that said she'd won something I didn't even know we were competing for. And I felt my face go hot with humiliation, but I kept my expression blank, because that's what I'd learned to do over 49 years of being the daughter who didn't quite measure up to her older sister's golden standard. I set my plate down carefully on the picnic table, my hands not quite steady, but my voice calm when I said I needed to check on something in my car, and I was about to walk away from the laughter and the pitying looks from relatives who'd heard my mother's pronouncement when my 14-year-old son Brandon, who'd been quiet all afternoon sitting in a lawn chair with his phone, looked up and said in that flat teenage voice that somehow made everything worse, "Grandma says you need to stop dreaming, Mom." The words hit me like a physical blow, not just because of what they meant, but because of what they revealed. My own mother had been talking about me behind my back to my son, telling my child that his mother was foolish for wanting things she couldn't have, for aspiring to anything beyond the small rental apartment where we lived and the 2 jobs I worked to keep us afloat. The whole yard went quiet for half a second, that awkward silence where everyone heard but pretended they hadn't. And then conversations picked up again with forced brightness. People suddenly very interested in the burr, potato salad, or the weather, or anything that wasn't the obvious cruelty that had just played out in front of them. I looked at Brandon, and his eyes slid away from mine, guilt written all over his young face, and I could see he regretted saying it out loud. But the damage was done. The truth was out there now, hanging in the air like smoke, and something shifted inside me then. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more focused. Like a door closing on one version of myself and opening on another version, who was tired of swallowing humiliation and pretending it didn't hurt. I walked to my car without saying goodbye to anyone, and Brandon followed me a few minutes later, his shoulders hunched with shame. And we drove home in silence, while I processed what had just happened, and what it meant about the way my family saw me. The role they'd assigned me in their collective narrative. The box they'd built around my life and expected me to stay in forever without complaint. My name is Kara Whitmore, and I'm 49 years old, divorced for 6 years from a man named Joel, who'd left me for a younger paralegal named Bev, who worked at his law firm. And I'm the mother to Brandon, who lives with me half the time, and with his father and Bev the other half under our custody arrangement that splits his weeks down the middle. During the day, I work as an administrative coordinator at a medical supply company called Henderson Health Solutions, the kind of job where you answer phones and manage schedules and order supplies and make sure other people's lives run smoothly, while your own feels like it's held together with duct tape and determination. And the pay is decent, but not great. $38,000 a year with benefits that barely cover the basics. 3 evenings a week. Plus every Saturday, I work retail at a home goods store called Living Spaces, folding towels and ringing up customers and restocking shelves for $12 an hour, which adds another $15,000 to my annual income and makes the difference between barely making it and actually making it each month with a little left over for savings. I've always been the practical daughter, the one who made sensible choices, who didn't cause drama, who paid her bills on time and kept her credit clean, and never asked for help she didn't absolutely need. The daughter who went to community college instead of university because it was cheaper, who married young because that's what you did in our small town, who worked her way up slowly in jobs that were stable rather than exciting. Natalie was different, always had been, the golden child who was beautiful and charming and somehow always landed on her feet, even when she made terrible decisions, like dropping out of college 3 times, or running up credit card debt that my parents bailed her out of, or marrying Austin, who came from money and had family connections that got him jobs he wasn't quite qualified for. Our parents had always favored her, not in cruel, obvious ways, but in 1,000 small preferences that added up over decades. The way they lit up when she walked into a room, the way they bragged about her accomplishments to neighbors while mentioning my existence almost as an afterthought, the way they helped her financially while telling me I needed to learn to stand on my own 2 feet. And I'd accepted it, the way you accept the weather, as something unchangeable and not worth fighting, because fighting would only make me look petty and jealous. But that comment at the barbecue, combined with Brandon's slip about what Grandma had been saying to him, started something itching in the back of my mind. A question I'd never let myself ask before. What exactly were they saying about me when I wasn't there? And why did my mother feel so comfortable mocking my dreams in front of the entire family? On the drive home from the barbecue, Brandon was quiet in the passenger seat, his phone glowing in his hands, but his attention clearly elsewhere, and I could feel the guilt radiating off him in waves. So I finally asked him directly what Grandma had told him about me and my supposed dreams that needed stopping. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his teenage body all angles and awkwardness, and said it was nothing really, just that I should be realistic about money stuff and not get my hopes up about things I couldn't afford. And when I pressed him gently, keeping my voice calm even though my heart was pounding, he admitted in a voice barely above a whisper that Grandma and Grandpa and Aunt Bev, his stepmother, had coffee together sometimes without me, and they talked about family things. Without me? I asked, my hands tightening on the steering wheel, and he nodded without looking at me, his eyes fixed on his phone screen. What do they say about me? I asked, and Brandon's jaw tightened the way it does when he knows something will hurt, but feels obligated to be honest, because I'd raised him to tell the truth even when it was uncomfortable, a trait he got from me, and one I was suddenly regretting teaching him. He took a breath and said quietly, his voice thick with discomfort, Aunt Bev says you have ideas above your station, and Grandma agrees with her, and they talk about how you need someone to help you see reality clearly. The phrase, ideas above your station, hung in the air between us like poison gas, Victorian and cruel, the kind of thing people said when they wanted to keep you in your place. And I felt something crack inside my chest, some faith I'd had in my family's basic goodness, or at least their basic fairness toward me. The phone call came 3 days later, on Wednesday evening, while I was folding laundry in my small 2-bedroom apartment. The place I'd rented after the divorce because it was affordable at $950 a month, and close to Brandon's school. and because I'd told myself it was temporary, even though 6 years had passed, and I was still there, still paying rent to someone else, instead of building equity in something of my own. My phone buzzed on the arm of the couch with Bev's name on the screen, which was unusual because we only talked about Brandon's schedule and drop-off times, and never about anything personal. Our relationship carefully cordial and limited to logistics, so I answered with caution already creeping into my voice. "Kara, hi," Bev said in that sweet, syrupy tone she uses when she wants something or when she's about to deliver bad news disguised as concern. "I was just talking to Donna and Harold earlier today, and we're all a little worried about you." I asked what she meant, folding one of Brandon's t-shirts with more force than necessary, and she took a breath, like she was gathering courage to say something difficult. Then told me they'd heard I was thinking about buying a house, which was true, though I hadn't told anyone in the family yet, except for mentioning it casually to Brandon. And apparently that information had traveled through the family network faster than I'd expected. Bev continued in that same false concern voice, "We just don't want you to embarrass yourself trying to get approved for something you can't afford, you know? The mortgage process can be really harsh, and with your income situation and everything, it might be better to just accept that renting is the more realistic option for you right now." The words were wrapped in fake concern, but the message underneath was crystal clear. Stay in your lane. Don't try to rise above where we've decided you belong. Don't make us uncomfortable by achieving something that might disrupt the family hierarchy, where Natalie owns and you rent, where Natalie succeeds and you survive. I asked Bev how she even knew I was looking at houses, keeping my voice neutral, even though anger was building in my chest like pressure. And she dodged the question smoothly, saying, "Small towns talk and people notice things." And then she added with a little laugh, "Your credit probably isn't strong enough anyway. And we'd hate to see you get rejected by a bank and feel bad about it when we could have warned you ahead of time." I ended the call as politely as I could manage, making some excuse about dinner burning on the stove, even though I hadn't started cooking yet. And my hands were shaking when I set the phone down. Not with fear, but with that quiet, controlled rage that comes when you realize people who are supposed to care about you are actively working against your success. Over the next week, I noticed my mother making comments at a family gathering for my aunt's birthday, telling relatives in my hearing that I was bad with money, laughing like it was a harmless joke, while painting a picture of me as financially irresponsible, even though I'd never missed a payment on anything in my life. Never bounced a check, never had a credit card declined, or a utility shut off for non-payment. The lies bothered me less than the purpose behind them. The way she was building a narrative about my incompetence that would justify whatever they were planning, whatever intervention or control they thought they needed to exercise over my life and my choices. Then on a Thursday afternoon, while I was at work at Henderson Health Solutions, my phone pinged with an alert from my credit monitoring app, one of those free services I'd signed up for years ago and mostly ignored except for the monthly score updates. And the alert said someone had tried to open a store credit card in my name at a furniture retailer called Homestead Furnishings, where I'd never shopped in my life, and the application had been declined, but the hard inquiry was there on my report, a mark I hadn't authorized that would drag down my credit score for the next 2 years. I pulled my full credit report that night after Brandon went to bed, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop and a growing sense of unease, scrolling through pages of information that should have been familiar, but now felt potentially compromised. Like someone had been rifling through my financial life while I wasn't looking. There it was, the unauthorized inquiry from 3 days ago, listed under hard inquiries, with the date and the company name, and when I called the store's credit department the next morning during my lunch break at work, they told me the application had come through their online system, with my correct name and social security number and date of birth, along with an email address I'd never seen before. Something like khitmore.personal@gmail instead of my actual email. I asked for more details, and the representative, bound by privacy policies and corporate procedures, couldn't tell me much except that the application had been submitted online and quickly declined due to their verification system flagging the email address as not matching their records. But the damage was done because the inquiry would sit on my report for 2 years, affecting my credit score and potentially my ability to get approved for a mortgage. I mentioned it to Brandon the next time I picked him up from his father's house for our custody exchange, keeping my tone casual while we drove toward my apartment, asking if he'd heard anything about credit cards or applications or anyone asking questions about my personal information. His response came too fast, too rehearsed, his voice going up slightly at the end, the way it does when he's lying or hiding something. When he said, "It's probably just a mistake, Mom. You know, identity theft happens all the time. People get hacked and stuff." I didn't push him right then, because I needed to know more before I confronted anyone directly. Needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before I made accusations I couldn't take back. But I filed his reaction away in my mind as another data point, another piece of a puzzle I was starting to see the shape of, even if I didn't have all the pieces yet. Instead of confronting Brandon or anyone else in the family, I called my mortgage officer, Gwen Porter, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair cut in a practical bob and a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated, who'd been walking me through the pre-approval process over the past 2 months since I'd first reached out to inquire about first-time homebuyer programs. I explained about the unauthorized inquiry, about the credit card application I'd never made, and Gwen was quiet for a moment, the kind of professional silence that meant she was thinking through implications, before she said, in her careful, measured voice, "This inquiry could block your approval, Kara, or at least delay it significantly while we sort it out. When underwriters see a recent hard inquiry for new credit right before a mortgage application, they see it as you trying to take on new debt, and that affects your debt-to-income ratio and your perceived reliability." She paused, clicking her computer mouse, and then added, "Unless we investigate where this came from and prove it was fraudulent, file the right disputes with the right documentation, underwriters are going to factor this into their decision, and it won't factor in your favor." I asked what I needed to do, and Gwen walked me through the process. File a fraud report with the credit bureaus, file a police report for identity theft, even if nothing came of it, just to have the documentation, gather any evidence I had about who might have access to my personal information, and be prepared for this to take time, possibly months, to resolve fully. "Do you have any idea who might have your information?" she asked, and I thought about Bev's warning call, about my mother's comments at the birthday party, about Brandon's nervous reaction, about the family coffee meetings I wasn't invited to, and I said I had suspicions, but no proof yet, nothing concrete enough to take to the police or the credit bureaus. Gwen told me to start documenting everything, every conversation and every interaction, and to file the dispute with the credit bureau immediately using their online system. And as I hung up, I felt the first cold edge of real anger cutting through my usual pattern of swallowing insults and moving on without making waves. 2 weeks crawled by while I waited for responses from the credit bureaus and tried to go about my normal life, working my 2 jobs and taking care of Brandon and pretending everything was fine at family gatherings, even though I was watching everyone more carefully now, looking for signs of conspiracy or coordination. Then Natalie sent out invitations to what she called a housewarming upgrade party, even though she'd lived in that house for 3 years already. But apparently she'd just finished a major renovation project that included a new kitchen with custom cabinets and quartz countertops, and a stamped concrete patio in the backyard with an outdoor fireplace and built-in seating. And she wanted everyone to come admire her success and her beautiful home and her perfect life. The invitation was thick cardstock with gold foil lettering, the kind of thing that probably costs $3 each to print, more than my weekly grocery budget for produce. And my mother called to make sure I was coming, her voice bright with the kind of excitement she never showed about anything in my life, bubbling over with pride in Natalie's accomplishments. I went to the party because refusing would have caused more drama than attending, would have given them ammunition to call me jealous or bitter or unable to celebrate family success, and I stood in Natalie's gleaming new kitchen with its professional-grade appliances and designer fixtures, while relatives and friends and neighbors circulated with wine glasses filled with expensive bottles that Natalie kept pointing out she'd selected herself from a boutique wine shop in the city. Natalie held court near the new island with its waterfall edge and pendant lighting, talking about the contractor and the decisions she'd made, and how the whole project had come in under budget, even though I knew from overhearing conversations that under budget for her probably still meant $40,000. More than I made in a year from both my jobs combined. At one point during the party, Natalie raised her voice slightly, clearly performing for the room full of guests, and said with a laugh that managed to sound both self-deprecating and smug at the same time, "Some of us just work harder, I guess," while looking directly at me where I stood near the new farmhouse sink with my cheap grocery store wine. Everyone followed her gaze to me, and I felt my face burn with humiliation. But I kept my expression neutral and took a sip of wine, swallowing both the wine and the insult together, adding it to the collection I'd been accumulating my whole life. I excused myself to the bathroom after a few minutes, needing space from the performance and the barely concealed judgment, and while I was washing my hands in Natalie's renovated powder room with its designer wallpaper and expensive fixtures, my phone buzzed in my pocket with a text from Paige Summers, my cousin on my father's side, and the only person in this family who'd ever been consistently honest with me, even when it was uncomfortable. Paige's message was short and devastating. Just one sentence that made my hands go cold and numb. "Kara, I just found out your parents co-signed Natalie's mortgage. Thought you should know." I read the message 3 times, my reflection in the mirror showing a woman who looked stunned and hurt and angry all at once, because suddenly so many things made sense in a horrible, crystallizing way. How Natalie had qualified for such an expensive house on her and Austin's modest incomes. How my parents had been so invested in Natalie's success and so dismissive of mine. How they'd never once offered to help me with a down payment or to co-sign a loan, but had apparently pledged their financial backing and their credit to support Natalie's dream home. And the unfairness of it hit me like a wave, stealing my breath. I left the party early, making excuses about an early shift at work the next morning, which was true, but not the real reason I needed to escape. And I drove straight to my parents' house, even though it was already 8 in the evening, because I needed answers and I needed them now before I had time to talk myself out of confronting them. I found my mother in her garden behind their modest ranch house on the edge of town, wearing her gardening gloves and kneeling among her tomato plants in the fading light. And when I asked her directly if she and Dad had co-signed Natalie's mortgage, she looked up at me with dirt on her knees and no shame whatsoever in her face when she said, "Yes, we did. What about it?" The casual admission, the complete lack of guilt or recognition that this might be hurtful, made me angrier than if she'd tried to deny it or make excuses. And I asked why they'd never mentioned it, why they'd helped Natalie buy a house but never offered to help me, never even discussed the possibility with me. Donna stood up slowly, pulling off her gloves and slapping them against her thigh to knock off the dirt, and said in that matter-of-fact tone she uses when she thinks she's being perfectly reasonable and can't understand why anyone would disagree. "We invested in the child who will take care of us, Kara. Natalie's house is our legacy, something that will stay in the family after we're gone and mean something to future generations. It was a smart financial decision." Harold came out onto the back porch then, alerted by our raised voices, and he added his agreement, saying they'd made a practical choice because Natalie was stable and successful and in a position to help them in their old age, while I'd made choices that put me in a weaker position financially. The divorce, and the 2 jobs, and the renting, and those were my choices, and I had to live with the consequences. I stood there in their backyard, absorbing this. The casual cruelty of it, the way they'd calculated my worth against Natalie's and found mine lacking. The way they'd invested in one daughter's future, while writing off the others as not worth their backing. and I was about to leave before I said something I couldn't take back when my mother added something that made my blood actually freeze in my veins, made the whole world tilt sideways for a moment. "We used some of your loan money too, you know," Donna said, brushing dirt off her pants. "For Natalie's down payment. You were fine with that. You never complained or asked for it back." I stared at her, my mind racing backward through years of small loans and emergency help and temporary transfers. Money I'd sent when they claimed the roof needed repair, or the car needed work, or they were short on property taxes, amounts that had seemed manageable at the time. A few hundred here and there, occasionally 1,000 for something urgent. And I'd never kept careful track because they were my parents, and you help family without keeping score. Or at least, that's what I'd believed. "What loan money?" I asked, my voice barely steady, and Donna waved her hand dismissively like I was being dramatic about nothing. "Oh, you know, all those times you helped us out over the years. We kept track of it all. We have records, and we'll settle up with you later, like we always said we would. But some of it went toward helping Natalie, because she's family too, and that's what family does. They help each other." The implications were staggering. They'd been taking money from me under false pretenses, using it to fund Natalie's house while telling me it was for their own emergencies. And they saw nothing wrong with this, nothing dishonest or manipulative about it. Just family helping family in whatever way made sense to them. That night, I went through my bank records with a focus I'd never applied before, pulling statements going back 7 years to when I'd first started being financially stable enough after the divorce to occasionally help my parents when they called with urgent needs. And I created a spreadsheet documenting every transfer I'd made to their account. The amounts were mostly small, $200 here, $500 there, occasionally 1,000 when they'd called with something truly urgent, like the time Dad said the furnace died in January, and they needed immediate replacement. And they'd always framed these requests as borrowing, as temporary, help they'd pay back when things settled down, or when their next Social Security check came, or when the pension payment cleared. I'd never pushed for repayment because they were my parents, and I'd been raised to help family without keeping score, to be generous and not petty about money. And besides, they'd raised me and fed me and clothed me for 18 years. So helping them seemed like a fair exchange, a way of honoring them and showing gratitude for everything they'd done for me. But now I was looking at the numbers with new eyes, with the knowledge that at least some of this money had gone to fund Natalie's down payment, and the total was staggering in a way that made me feel physically sick. $42,000 over 7 years. $42,000 I'd sent from my 2 jobs, from my careful budgeting, from the money I should have been saving for my own down payment on my own house, my own future, my own dreams that they'd laughed about at the barbecue. I kept digging through old text messages and emails, looking for evidence of their promises to repay me. And I found a text from Donna from 3 years ago that made me physically nauseous when I read it, with my new understanding. "This goes toward the house fund, sweetie. We'll settle everything later, when things are more settled with the property situation." The house fund, not their emergency fund, or their general savings, but specifically toward a house. And I'd been too trusting or too naive to question which house she meant, assuming she was talking about their own house, about maintaining the property they'd lived in for 30 years. I took screenshots of everything, backed up the files to my computer and to a cloud storage service and to a USB drive that I kept in my desk at work, because I was starting to understand that I might need evidence, might need to prove what had been done to me if this went somewhere legal or if they tried to deny it later. Then I sat in the dark in my small apartment after midnight, the city quiet outside my windows, and I cried for the first time in years. Not gentle tears, but hard, painful sobs that felt like they were tearing something out of my chest. And I wasn't crying from sadness, but from rage and betrayal, and the kind of clarity that only comes when you finally see people for who they really are, instead of who you needed them to be. I'd spent 49 years trying to be good enough, trying to earn their approval, or at least their basic respect. Working 2 jobs and raising my son alone and paying my bills and being responsible and reliable. And it had never been enough because the game was rigged from the start. Because they decided long ago that Natalie was the winner and I was the supporting character whose role was to help facilitate Natalie's success while staying quietly in my designated place below her in the family hierarchy. The next morning, I woke up with puffy eyes and a headache, but also with something new. Determination, cold and clear and focused, because I was done swallowing humiliation and I was done letting them control the narrative about my life and my worth. Brandon came over that Tuesday for his usual week with me, his backpack full of dirty laundry and homework he'd neglected, and I could tell immediately that something was wrong from the way he avoided eye contact and went straight to his room without the usual small talk about school or friends or the video game he'd been playing. I let Brandon settle for an hour, giving him space to decompress from whatever was bothering him, and then I knocked on his door and asked if we could talk. And when he finally looked at me, his young face was guilty and miserable in equal measure, torn between loyalties he shouldn't have to navigate. I asked him directly what Bev had told him about my mortgage plans, about my dream of buying a house, keeping my voice gentle, because I could see he was already stressed and I didn't want to make him feel worse. And he shifted on his bed, picking at a loose thread on his comforter, before saying quietly, "She told me you'll never qualify anyway, Mom. She said you don't make enough money and your credit isn't good enough and it would just be embarrassing when you got rejected by the bank. And she thought someone should manage your expectations so you wouldn't get your hopes up for nothing." The words stung, even though I'd expected something like this, and I asked if Bev had said anything else, and Brandon's jaw tightened before he admitted in a rush like he needed to get it out fast. "Grandma and Grandpa asked me to keep you calm. They said you get ideas sometimes, unrealistic ideas, and someone needs to help you see things clearly. And they thought since I'm your son, I could maybe help you understand that renting is okay and you don't need to try to compete with Aunt Natalie." The phrase, "manage your expectations," combined with "keep you calm," made it clear that they saw me as someone who needed to be managed and controlled rather than supported. Someone whose dreams were problems to be solved rather than goals to be encouraged. And I was processing this when Brandon said something that made my hands go cold and my heart start racing. "Dad made me sign something last week," he said, not meeting my eyes. He said it was just routine paperwork for his taxes, something about household income, but Aunt Bev was there and she seemed really interested in it, asking me questions about where you work and how much you probably make and what bills you pay. My stomach dropped because I suddenly understood what they'd done. The mechanism they'd used to get access to information about my financial situation without my permission or knowledge. They'd used Brandon, my 14-year-old son, to obtain details about my income and expenses, possibly even using our combined household income during the weeks Brandon stayed with them to make some kind of application or verification that I knew nothing about. I asked Brandon what kind of paperwork it was, and he shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, but also relieved to finally tell someone, and said it had something to do with household income and expenses. And there was a section where he'd filled in information about both households, his dad's and mine, including approximate income and monthly costs. Bev had helped him fill it out, he said, being really friendly and helpful, and she'd asked him questions in a casual way that hadn't seemed suspicious at the time, but now, in retrospect, felt calculated and manipulative. Questions about my work schedule, and whether I ever complained about money, and whether I'd mentioned trying to buy a house. I thanked Brandon for telling me the truth, assured him he hadn't done anything wrong, and that he'd been manipulated by adults who should have known better. And then I made him promise not to sign anything else for his father or Bev without checking with me first. And he agreed with visible relief, like he'd been waiting for permission to set that boundary. The next morning, I called Gwen and asked if there had been any other activity on my mortgage pre-approval anything I hadn't authorized or any application started in my name without my knowledge, and she put me on hold while she checked her system, the hold music playing cheerfully while my anxiety spiraled higher and higher. When Gwen came back on the line, her voice was careful and confused in a way that made my anxiety spike even higher, and she said slowly, "Kara, this is strange and I'm not sure what to make of it. A pre-approval application was started in your name 2 weeks ago, on July 15th, with all your correct information, including your social security number and employment details, but then it was suddenly withdrawn before official submission. The notes in our system say you changed your mind and decided not to pursue financing at this time, but I never spoke to you about any of this, and I don't have any record of you contacting us to withdraw." My heart was pounding now, a sick rapid beat that made me dizzy, because I'd never started a second application. I'd been working exclusively with Gwen on the one pre-approval process, and someone had clearly tried to either interfere with my real mortgage application or start a fake one using my stolen information. I asked Gwen to check the contact information on the withdrawn application, and I could hear her clicking through screens on her computer before she said slowly, reading carefully, "The email address is different from yours, Kara. It's similar but not exact, one letter off in the middle. Instead of Kara.Whitmore, it says Kara.WH.Wantmore with a number 1 instead of the letter I. And there's a phone number listed that I don't recognize, not the number I have on file for you." She read off the number, and I didn't recognize it either, didn't know who it belonged to. But the pattern was becoming crystal clear now. Someone had tried to interfere with my mortgage application process, using information they'd gathered about me, possibly through Brandon or through my parents, who'd helped me with paperwork over the years, and might have kept copies of documents with my personal details. I asked Gwen if there was any way to track where that application had come from, any digital footprint or system logs that might show who'd accessed their online portal to start the fake application, and she hesitated before saying carefully, "I can pull the submission log if you want me to, Kara. It shows IP addresses and device information for anyone who accesses our online pre-approval system. But I have to tell you, if someone's been accessing your information without permission and trying to interfere with your mortgage application, this is identity fraud at a minimum, and possibly something more serious. You might need to file a police report and definitely need to report this to the credit bureaus." I told her to pull the log and send it to me via secure email, that I'd handle whatever needed to happen next, and while I waited for her email to arrive, I sat at my desk at work pretending to process supply orders, while my mind spun through possibilities, through family members who had my information, through people who had both motive and opportunity to sabotage my chance at buying a house because my success would somehow diminish theirs or disrupt their carefully constructed narrative about who I was supposed to be in this family. The submission log arrived in my email that afternoon around 3, a technical document full of timestamps and IP addresses and device identifiers that would have meant nothing to me except for one crucial piece of information that Gwen had highlighted in yellow. The IP address traced back to a location in Cedar Falls, the small town 20 miles west where Bev lived and worked as a paralegal at a law firm called Morrison & Associates. I stared at that detail, at the date and timestamp that showed a Thursday afternoon at 2:15, a time when Brandon would have been at school and Joel would have been at work and Bev would have been at her office with access to computers and legal databases and the kind of information gathering tools that paralegals use in their daily work. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Bev had somehow obtained enough of my personal information, possibly through Brandon's paperwork or through my parents who'd helped me years ago with tax documents when I was going through my divorce. And she'd attempted to start a mortgage application in my name using her office computer and her office internet connection, not realizing or not caring that online systems track IP addresses and device information for exactly this reason. I forwarded the log to Gwen and asked what my options were legally and practically, and she replied within an hour with a careful message that laid out the situation. I can't officially accuse anyone of fraud, Kara. That's between you and law enforcement and the credit bureaus. But if you want to file a formal dispute with our company and with the 3 major credit bureaus, I can help you with the documentation you'll need. This kind of interference is serious, and someone is actively trying to damage your credit profile and block your mortgage approval, and you have a right to protect yourself and pursue legal remedies. I sat with that knowledge for the rest of the workday, weighing my options carefully, knowing that pursuing this officially would blow apart whatever fragile piece existed in my family, would make me the villain in their story, the ungrateful daughter who accused family members of crimes instead of handling things quietly within the family structure. But I also knew that if I didn't fight back now, document everything, and establish firm boundaries with legal backing, they'd keep controlling my life, keep sabotaging my chances at independence, keep ensuring I stayed in the smaller, weaker position they'd decided I belonged in permanently. By the time I left work at 5, I'd made my decision. I would fight, but I would do it smart and methodical, with documentation and legal representation, because going in angry and unprepared would just make them dismiss me as emotional and unstable, the way they always had whenever I tried to stand up for myself in the past. I spent that weekend putting together what I thought of as my war folder, a clean, organized collection of evidence in both digital and physical form, with subfolders for different categories of wrongdoing and manipulation. In one folder, I put screenshots and PDFs of all the bank transfers to my parents over 7 years, with detailed notes about what they'd told me each amount was for, and their promises to pay me back that had never materialized into actual repayment. In another folder, I put my credit report showing the unauthorized inquiry from the furniture store, along with the dispute I'd already filed and the responses I'd received from the credit bureau asking for more information. In a third folder, I put the submission log from the mortgage company showing the IP address trace to Cedar Falls, along with the text messages from Bev and my mother, and my notes from conversations with Brandon about what they'd told him and what paperwork he'd signed under false pretenses. I created a timeline documenting everything from the barbecue comment on June 23rd to the present day in mid-August, making sure dates and events lined up clearly, showing the pattern of sabotage and control that had been exercised against me. Then I searched online for attorneys who specialized in family law and financial disputes, looking specifically for someone with experience in cases involving financial abuse and elder manipulation, even though I wasn't elderly, and this was more about family control than traditional abuse. But the principles seemed similar enough. I found an attorney named Harper Wells who had good reviews and a profile that mentioned she'd helped clients establish boundaries with controlling family members and pursue restitution for financial exploitation. And I scheduled a consultation for Monday afternoon, taking a long lunch from my day job to make the appointment. Harper's office was in a renovated Victorian house downtown, professional but not intimidating, with comfortable furniture and plants in the windows and framed degrees on the walls that showed she'd been practicing for 20 years. When I met with her on Monday, I brought printed copies of everything in my war folder, and she spent a full hour reviewing the documents carefully, asking questions about family dynamics and relationships and what I hoped to achieve, making notes in a leather folder while I explained the whole situation from beginning to present. When she finally looked up at me, her expression was serious and a little sad, the way people look when they've seen this pattern before and know how it ends, and she said in a firm, clear voice, "Kara, this isn't just cruelty for the sake of being mean to you. This is about control and maintaining a family structure where you're supposed to be the reliable helper who never succeeds independently, and your potential success threatens that entire structure they've built." She tapped the bank statements with one manicured finger and continued, "They owe you $42,000 based on these records and their own text messages acknowledging the money as loans. They've used you financially for years while simultaneously limiting your opportunities for advancement, and now they're actively sabotaging your mortgage application because you buying a house disrupts their narrative about who you are and where you belong in the family hierarchy. I asked what I could do legally, what remedies existed for this kind of family financial abuse, and Harper laid out my options with the same clear, methodical approach she'd used reviewing my documents. I could demand repayment of the loans with the text evidence showing their promises. I could pursue the identity fraud issue with law enforcement and the credit bureaus and potentially press charges. I could establish firm legal boundaries about access to my personal information and Brandon's involvement in gathering intelligence about me. And I could cut off all financial support immediately with legal documentation protecting me if they tried to claim I'd abandoned elderly parents. But, Harper warned, leaning back in her leather chair and looking at me directly with eyes that had clearly seen a lot of family drama over 2 decades of practice. This will get loud, Kara. They'll fight back hard. They'll call you ungrateful and dramatic and selfish. They'll accuse you of tearing the family apart over money. They'll tell everyone who'll listen that you've abandoned your elderly parents and turned your back on your sister when she needs you. They'll probably try to turn Brandon against you, make him feel guilty for being caught in the middle. And they might escalate their sabotage efforts before you can get legal protections in place, might try to do more damage to your credit or your reputation or your relationship with your son. She paused to let that sink in, then added, I need you to be absolutely certain you're ready for that fight before we proceed. Because once we start filing formal complaints and sending legal letters, there's no going back to the way things were. Your relationship with your parents and your sister will be permanently damaged, maybe destroyed completely, and you need to be okay with that possibility. I thought about it for a long moment, sitting in her comfortable office with afternoon sun coming through the windows, and I realized that my relationship with my parents and Natalie was already damaged beyond repair. Had been damaged for years, or maybe forever. Because you can't have a real relationship with people who see you as a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. The barbecue comment, the $42,000 in stolen money, the credit sabotage, the manipulation of my son, the conspiracy meetings without me, the mocking of my dreams while using my money to fund someone else's dreams. All of it added up to a truth I'd been avoiding my whole life. They didn't love me the way I needed to be loved. And staying in relationship with them meant accepting abuse and control in exchange for the illusion of family connection. I told Harper I was ready, that I wanted to pursue everything we could legally pursue, and she nodded with satisfaction like I'd passed some kind of test. And we spent the next hour developing a strategy. First, she would send a formal demand letter to my parents requesting repayment of the $42,000 within 30 days, with copies of all the bank transfers and text messages attached as evidence, making it clear this wasn't a request for a gift or an emotional plea, but a legal demand for repayment of documented loans. Second, she would help me file formal fraud reports with all 3 major credit bureaus regarding the unauthorized credit inquiries and the fake mortgage application, with copies of the submission log and Brandon's testimony about the paperwork he'd been tricked into signing. Third, she would draft a cease and desist letter to Bev, specifically, warning her that any further attempts to access my financial information or involve Brandon in intelligence gathering would result in criminal charges for identity theft and fraud. And fourth, she would help me document everything going forward, teaching me how to save emails and texts and record conversations where legally permitted, building a case file that would protect me if things escalated to the point of needing restraining orders or criminal prosecution. The retainer was expensive, $2,500 that I didn't really have, but that I paid anyway using money from my emergency savings, because this was an emergency, even if it didn't look like the traditional kind with sirens and ambulances. Harper said she'd have the first letters drafted by the end of the week, ready for my review and approval before sending. And I left her office feeling simultaneously terrified and empowered, like I just jumped off a cliff, but at least I'd chosen to jump rather than being pushed. The family dinner happened 2 weeks later, before Harper's letters had been sent, but after I'd made my decision to fight back legally. one of my mother's periodic attempts at gathering everyone for what she called family peace night. Though peace in Donna's vocabulary usually meant everyone agreeing with whatever she and Harold wanted. The invitation had come by group text, cheerful and insistent, in that way my mother had of making optional things feel mandatory, and I'd almost declined, but Harper had advised me to go, to observe, to document any additional attempts at manipulation, now that I was watching for them with educated eyes. I arrived at my parents' house with Brandon, who'd been unusually quiet lately, clearly feeling the tension even though I'd tried to shield him from the worst of it. And the house smelled like pot roast, an artificial cinnamon air freshener, the combination making my stomach turn with anxiety and muscle memory of 1,000 similar gatherings. Natalie was already there with Austin, both of them looking pleased about something in a way that set off alarm bells in my head. And Bev had come too, even though she wasn't technically family anymore, sitting next to Harold in the living room, like she belonged there more than I did, like she'd earned her place through conspiracy while I'd lost mine through the crime of wanting independence. We made it through dinner with surface-level conversation, carefully avoiding any real topics, everyone pretending things were normal, while undercurrents of tension and unspoken agendas swirled beneath every polite comment about the weather and Brandon's school year. Then Donna brought out dessert, her famous apple pie that she only made for special occasions. And Natalie cleared her throat in that way she has when she's about to make an announcement and wants everyone's full attention. "We wanted you all to hear this together," she said, reaching for Austin's hand across the table, her smile radiant in a way that made me want to look away. "We're pregnant. The baby's due in March." The table erupted in congratulations and excitement, my mother actually crying happy tears and jumping up to hug Natalie, my father beaming with pride, and Bev exclaiming loudly about being an aunt, which wasn't technically accurate since she was just my ex-husband's current wife, but no one corrected her. And I sat there feeling like I was watching the scene from outside my body, seeing how they all lit up for Natalie's news in a way they never had for anything in my life. Then Natalie added, still smiling that radiant smile while placing one hand on her still flat stomach, "Which means we're going to need the bigger house even more now, for the nursery and playroom and all the baby stuff, so this renovation we're planning for next spring is really going to be necessary." There was a pause, a beat of expectant silence, before my mother turned to me with that look I knew too well, the one that meant she was about to ask for something while making it seem like I'd be selfish to refuse. "So you'll keep helping financially, right, Kara?" she asked, and it wasn't really a question, her tone making it clear that the correct answer was already determined. Now that there's a baby coming, family needs to pull together more than ever, and Natalie's going to need support to get through the pregnancy and get the house ready. I took a slow breath, feeling everyone's eyes on me, and said as politely as I could manage while my heart pounded, "I can't help financially right now, Mom. I have my own expenses and my own goals that I'm working toward." The temperature in the room dropped so fast I could almost see frost forming on the water glasses, the cheerful family atmosphere evaporating like it had never existed. Harold's face hardened into that disappointed expression I'd seen my whole life, the one that said I'd failed to meet basic expectations again. And he said quietly with barely controlled anger, "That's selfish, Kara. This is about family, about a baby, about supporting your sister when she needs you most." Natalie's eyes filled with perfectly timed tears, her pregnancy announcement joy transforming instantly into wounded victim, and she said in a trembling voice, "I thought you'd be happy for me. I thought you'd want to help me prepare for motherhood. But I guess I was wrong about our relationship." Bev leaned over toward Brandon and whispered something just loud enough that I could hear it clearly, obviously meant for my ears, and she said in a concerned tone, dripping with false sympathy, "She's turning unstable, sweetheart. Sometimes stress makes people act irrationally." The words hung in the air like an accusation, like a diagnosis, and I saw Brandon's face go red with embarrassment and confusion, torn between defending me and not wanting to cause a bigger scene. I realized in that moment that this was exactly what Harper had predicted would happen. The pattern where they'd frame my perfectly reasonable boundaries as emotional instability, where saying no to their demands became evidence that I needed their intervention and control. I didn't argue or defend myself or try to explain why their request was manipulative and unfair, just quietly gathered my purse and told Brandon we were leaving. And my mother called after us in that wounded voice she uses so effectively about how I was overreacting and making everything dramatic and ruining what should have been a happy family celebration of new life. We drove home in silence, Brandon staring out the window, and I knew I'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That the family dinner disaster would be retold and reframed in their version where I was the villain who couldn't be happy for her pregnant sister. The next morning, Tuesday, my bank called while I was at my desk at work, the fraud prevention department, and the representative asked in a professional but concerned voice if I was aware that someone had attempted to add Donna Whitmore as an authorized user and co-owner of my checking account overnight. I said absolutely not, my hands going cold, and the representative explained that the attempt had been made through their online banking system using my account number and enough personal verification information to get past the first security layer. My mother's maiden name, my first pet's name, the street I grew up on. But it had failed at the second verification step, where they asked for a code sent to my registered phone number. I confirmed that Donna was my mother, and that I had definitely not authorized her to have any access to my bank account. And I requested an immediate full security review and changes to all my verification questions to things my family wouldn't know. The bank representative walked me through the process patiently, helping me set up new security phrases using obscure details like my favorite teacher from college and the make of my first car that I'd bought with my own money after the divorce, things my family would never think to guess. She noted in my account file that there had been an unauthorized access attempt by a family member, which would flag any future requests for additional scrutiny. And she asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint or pursue legal action against whoever had tried to access my account. I said I was already working with an attorney on related issues and would handle it through those channels. And after I hung up, I immediately called Harper and told her what had happened, adding it to the growing list of boundary violations and attempted financial interference. Harper's voice was grim when she said, "They're escalating because you said no at the dinner, Kara. They're trying to prove that you need their oversight by creating situations where you appear disorganized or vulnerable or in need of protection. This is classic controlling behavior. When the victim starts to break free, the abusers ramp up their efforts to regain control." She paused, then added with a hint of anger breaking through her professional calm, "And I'll tell you what's going to happen next if we don't act fast. They're going to try to make you look financially reckless or mentally unstable, create documentation of your supposed incompetence, and then use that to justify taking over your finances for your own good. We need to file everything now today, before they can do more damage." That afternoon, I approved Harper's demand letter for the $42,000 and her cease and desist letter to Bev, and she sent both via certified mail requiring signatures, so we'd have proof of delivery, and no one could claim they never received them. Then I spent the evening putting alerts on every financial account I had, locking down my credit with all 3 bureaus, so no one could open new accounts or apply for credit in my name without going through additional verification, setting up 2-factor authentication on every online service from my bank to my utility companies. It felt paranoid and exhausting, like living in a state of siege. But Harper assured me it was necessary and appropriate given the pattern of interference and attempted financial manipulation. The fraud disputes with the credit bureaus took weeks to process, requiring multiple rounds of documentation and verification. But Harper knew exactly how to navigate the bureaucracy, and she submitted everything with the kind of professional precision that made the bureaus take it seriously. We provided the submission logs showing the IP address traced to Bev's workplace, We provided Brandon's written statement about the paperwork he'd been tricked into signing. We provided evidence of the attempted bank account access and the pattern of financial control my family had exercised over years. 6 weeks after we filed the initial disputes, I got a letter from the First Credit Bureau stating that they'd investigated the unauthorized inquiry and determined it was fraudulent, and they were removing it from my report and flagging the accounts involved for fraud investigation. The letter included information about the source of the inquiry, the email address that had been used to submit the application, which the retailer was required to preserve, and the email headers traced back to an account registered through Morrison & Associates, the law firm where Bev worked as a paralegal. Harper showed me the documentation with a grim expression and said what we both already knew. "This is evidence of fraud, Kara. Your ex-husband's wife used her position at a law firm to access systems and submit credit applications in your name, probably thinking her legal knowledge would help her cover her tracks, or that you'd never pursue it because of family pressure to keep things quiet." I asked what we could do with this information, and Harper laid out the options systematically. We could file a police report for identity theft, which would create an official record. We could send an additional cease and desist letter to Bev, specifically addressing this new evidence. We could notify the State Bar Association about her misuse of law firm resources for personal criminal activity. And we could use all of this as evidence if the family tried to pursue any kind of legal action, claiming I was unstable or incompetent and needed their guardianship. Harper recommended we do all of it. Create a paper trail so comprehensive that no judge or authority would be able to dismiss what had been done to me. And I agreed, even though part of me felt sick at the idea of destroying Bev's career and potentially sending her to jail over credit card applications. But Harper was firm. She didn't just make a mistake or have poor judgment. She committed multiple felonies using sophisticated knowledge of legal systems, and she did it deliberately to harm you financially. That deserves consequences. The police report was filed on a Thursday afternoon at our local station. It's with Harper accompanying me and presenting all the documentation in a way that made it clear this wasn't a family squabble, but actual identity theft with forensic evidence. The officer who took our report was young and seemed a bit overwhelmed by the complexity, but Harper walked him through everything patiently, and we left with a case number and assurance that it would be forwarded to the Detective Division for investigation. While all this legal machinery was grinding forward, while letters were being sent and reports were being filed and evidence was being compiled, I kept moving toward my actual goal, which was buying a house and establishing my independence, regardless of what my family thought or did. Gwen called me on a Monday morning in early October, with news that made everything else fade into the background temporarily. "Kara, I have really good news. There's a small first-time homebuyer program through your credit union that I think you're absolutely perfect for. And now that we've cleaned up your credit report by removing that fraudulent inquiry, I think you'd be approved quickly." She explained the details enthusiastically, how the program was designed specifically for people with stable employment and good payment history, who'd faced barriers to traditional financing, how it offered slightly higher interest rates, but much more flexible approval criteria, focusing on actual payment behavior rather than debt-to-income ratios. How it was funded through a state housing authority, specifically to help working-class people achieve home ownership. If you can show stable savings over the past 6 months, which I know you have because I've seen your bank statements, and we can document that the issues with your credit were due to fraud that you're actively pursuing, which we can, with the police report and credit bureau determinations, I think you'd be approved within 2 weeks, Gwen said, and I could hear genuine excitement in her voice, like she'd invested emotionally in my success. You'd probably qualify for up to $215,000, which in this market should get you a solid starter home, maybe a small 2-bedroom house or a nice condo in a good neighborhood. I felt hope bloom in my chest, fragile but real, the kind of hope I'd been afraid to feel fully because disappointment would hurt too much, and I told Gwen, yes, let's do it. let's submit the application." But then Gwen's voice got serious, and she added something that reminded me the fight wasn't over yet. "Kara, I need to be completely honest with you about something. We've had 2 more unauthorized inquiries attempted on your credit just this past week, both flagged and blocked by the security freezes you put in place. But they're coming from someone who has detailed information about you and knows enough to answer basic verification questions. Until we completely stop whoever's doing this, your application could still be at risk of sabotage, even with all our protections in place." I told her about the police report and the evidence against Bev and the cease and desist letters that had been sent. And Gwen said that should help, but we needed to move fast, get the application submitted and processed before my family could figure out new ways to interfere. We submitted everything that afternoon, all my documentation and bank statements and employment verification, and the police report showing the fraud wasn't my fault. And then I waited in an agony of hope and anxiety, checking my email obsessively and jumping every time my phone rang. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, while I was restocking shelves at the home goods store during my retail shift, Gwen called with news that made my knees literally weak. "Kara, congratulations. You're pre-approved. The credit union board reviewed your application this morning, and you're approved for up to $215,000 at 5.2% interest. We can start looking at properties immediately if you're ready." I had to sit down on a box of bathroom towels in the stockroom, my hands shaking and tears suddenly streaming down my face. Because this was real. This was actually happening. I'd fought through the sabotage and the family betrayal and the financial abuse, and I'd won. I'd actually won my independence. I called Harper immediately to tell her the news, and she actually laughed with delight, a sound I'd never heard from her in all our serious legal meetings. And she said, "You did it, Kara. Despite everything they tried to do to stop you, you're buying a house. That's not just a financial victory, that's you reclaiming your entire life." I took the rest of my shift off, claiming a family emergency, which my manager approved without question since I never called out. And I drove to a coffee shop and just sat there for an hour processing what this meant, that in a matter of weeks I could own property, could have equity and stability, and something that was mine alone, that no one could give away or take away or use as leverage against me. The family drama exploded 2 days later when my parents received Harper's demand letter for the $42,000 with all the evidence attached, and my mother called me screaming, actually screaming into the phone, about how dare I treat them like criminals and drag family business into legal matters and try to extort money from my elderly parents who would only ever tried to help me. I let her rant for about 30 seconds and then I said calmly, "Mom, you took $42,000 from me under false pretenses and used it to help Natalie buy her house. Harper's letter lays out all the evidence. If you want to dispute it, you can respond to her directly." Donna's voice went from screaming to cold, that icy tone she uses when she's truly angry, and she said, "If you pursue this, you're not part of this family anymore. We'll cut you off completely, and you'll regret it when you're alone and have no one to help you." I took a breath and said something I'd never had the courage to say before. "Mom, you already cut me off emotionally years ago. You just kept me around financially. I'm done being your bank." Then I hung up before she could respond, and I blocked her number, and my father's number, and Natalie's number. Not permanently, but just until I could get through the house buying process without their interference and their attempts to guilt me into backing down. Bev received Harper's cease and desist letter the same day, delivered to her at work at the law firm, and according to Harper's sources, she'd gone pale reading it and had immediately requested a meeting with her supervising partner. Within a week, Bev had resigned from Morrison & Associates rather than face an internal investigation about her misuse of firm resources and her criminal activity using work computers, and Joel called me in a panic, saying Bev was threatening to file for bankruptcy and blame me for destroying her career. I told Joel I was sorry he was caught in the middle, but Bev had committed multiple felonies and there were consequences for that, and if he'd been a better father, He would have protected his son from being used as an intelligence-gathering tool instead of enabling his wife's fraud. That conversation ended badly, with Joel yelling and me hanging up. But I felt no guilt, because I'd spent too many years accepting guilt for things that weren't my fault, and I was done with that pattern completely. Natalie called a few days after she received news about the demand letter, and unlike our mother, she wasn't screaming, just crying in that exhausted, defeated way that sounded genuine rather than manipulative. "Kara, I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I knew what Mom and Dad were doing with your money. I knew they were funneling it to me, and I told myself it was okay because they said you agreed to help family. But that was a lie. I told myself, so I didn't have to feel guilty about taking advantage of you." She paused, crying harder, and then said, "The house is falling apart financially. The mortgage payment went up $400 when the adjustable rate reset last month, and we need a new roof that's going to cost $12,000, and the property taxes just got reassessed higher. Mom and Dad are tapped out from covering our shortfalls, and Austin and I can't afford it on our own, and I'm pregnant and terrified, and I don't know what to do." I felt a flicker of sympathy for her, buried under layers of anger and betrayal, but I kept my voice steady when I said, "Natalie, I'm sorry you're struggling, but I can't help you financially. I won't help you financially. You need to figure out your own situation without using me as a backup bank." There was a long silence, and then Natalie said something that made me actually respect her for the first time in years. "I know. You're right. I need to sell the house probably. Downsize to something we can actually afford. Stop pretending to have a lifestyle we can't maintain. It's going to be humiliating, but it's also probably the healthiest thing I could do." She took a shaky breath and added, "I'm telling you this because I want you to know something else. Mom and Dad were planning to ambush you next week. Get you to co-sign a refinance on my house. They had papers drawn up and everything. A whole plan for how to pressure you into signing. That's why Bev was trying so hard to wreck your credit, so you couldn't qualify to co-sign and they'd have to find another way to save my house. I'm telling you so you can protect yourself." I thanked her for the warning, genuinely grateful even though it didn't change anything between us. And after we hung up, I called Harper and told her about the planned ambush. Harper said grimly, "They're getting desperate, which makes them more dangerous. If they try to pressure you into signing anything, call me immediately. And maybe don't go to any family gatherings alone for a while." The ambush attempt came exactly when Natalie had predicted, a week later, presented as a quick family meeting about financial planning, in a group text that made it sound casual and brief. I arrived with Harper, who'd agreed to come as my attorney and witness. And the look on my parents' faces when we walked in together was almost worth everything I'd been through. This mixture of shock and anger and fear, because they'd been planning to manipulate me in private, and now there was a professional witness who wouldn't let them gaslight me later about what had been said. The meeting was set up in their dining room like a business transaction. Papers already laid out on the table in neat stacks, and I could see the loan documents ready for signatures. A refinance application for Natalie's mortgage, with a space for a cosigner, and all my personal information already filled in somehow. Harold gestured to the chair across from him, like this was just a formality, like my signature was inevitable. And he said in his stern father voice, "Kara, we need you to help your sister. The bank requires a co-signer for this refinance, and you're the only one who qualifies now that we've maxed out our own credit helping Natalie. Just sign here and here and here, and everything will be easier for everyone." Bev was there too, even though I'd sent her a cease and desist letter, sitting next to my mother with a fake pleasant expression, like she had any right to be involved in family financial decisions. And she added in that syrupy voice, "It's really the least you can do, Kara, considering how much this family has done for you over the years. All the support and love and guidance we've given you." I looked at the papers, at the numbers that would make me legally responsible for a $340,000 mortgage on a house I'd never live in and never own, for payments I could never afford if Natalie and my parents defaulted, and I said quietly but firmly, "No, I'm not signing anything." The room went completely silent for about 3 seconds, everyone frozen in shock that I'd actually refused directly instead of making excuses. And then Bev's calm facade cracked and she actually raised her voice, saying with real anger, "You think you're better than your sister? Better than this family? You're so selfish you'd let Natalie lose her house while she's pregnant?" Natalie started crying on cue, but this time the tears looked real and exhausted rather than manipulative. And Harper calmly interrupted the building chaos by saying in her professional attorney voice, "Before we go any further with emotional arguments, I'd like to see the full loan history for this property. I want to see who's paid what and when, documented with bank records." My parents exchanged glances, and Bev said quickly that we didn't need to dig into old history, but Harper insisted with polite, implacable firmness, and after a long, tense moment, Harold got up and pulled a file box from the buffet and slid it across the table toward Harper. Harper went through the documents methodically, comparing them to the records I'd provided of my transfers to my parents over the years, and it took her less than 15 minutes to establish the pattern that I'd suspected but never had confirmed with such devastating clarity. Every major payment to Natalie's mortgage over the past 4 years had corresponded almost exactly with a loan request my parents had made to me, the amounts matching within a few $100s, often within days of each other. "This payment here," Harper said, pointing to a $3,200 transfer from my parents to Natalie's mortgage company dated April 15th, 2 years ago, corresponds to this text message where Donna requested $3,000 from Kara for emergency roof repair on their house. This $1,800 payment matches this request for car transmission replacement. This $2,500 payment matches this supposedly urgent property tax shortfall. She laid out a dozen examples, creating a visual timeline on the table that showed clearly and undeniably how my money had been funneled through my parents directly to support Natalie's mortgage, while I'd been told I was helping with their own emergencies. The room was absolutely silent, except for the sound of papers being laid on the table. And Harper pulled out her final piece of evidence, the comprehensive bank statement summary showing my total contributions over 7 years. Kara has transferred $42,315 to her parents under false pretenses, Harper said, her voice allowing no argument. Those transfers were made based on explicit representations that the money was needed for legitimate household emergencies and would be repaid when their financial situation improved. Instead, it was systematically used to subsidize Natalie's mortgage payments. And now you're asking Kara to legally commit to even more financial support through a co-signed refinance that would put her at risk for hundreds of thousands in debt. That's not family support. That's financial exploitation. My mother's face had gone white and her hands were shaking, and my father's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. And Bev looked like she wanted to argue, but couldn't find words because Harper had methodically destroyed every justification they might have offered with documented evidence that couldn't be disputed or reinterpreted. Harold tried to salvage something from the wreckage, tried to regain control of the narrative, and his voice was low and dangerous when he said, "We did what we had to do to keep this family together, to make sure everyone was taken care of, to invest in the next generation. Sometimes parents have to make hard choices about how to distribute family resources. And we chose to invest in Natalie's future because she's building something lasting, while Kara has always been more transient, more unstable." Harper didn't even look up from organizing her documents when she replied with devastating calm. "You took $42,000 from one daughter through systematic deception to subsidize the other daughter's lifestyle that she couldn't afford. Then, when the first daughter tried to achieve financial independence by buying her own modest home, you attempted to sabotage her credit rating through identity fraud. That's not parenting, Mr. Whitmore. That's exploitation and abuse." Bev stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and said we were twisting everything, making it seem worse than it was, taking normal family helping patterns and making them sound criminal. I spoke directly to her for the first time since arriving, my voice steady and cold. You kept a file on me, Bev. You documented strategies for keeping me financially dependent. You used my son to gather information about my income and spending. You submitted fraudulent credit applications from your workplace computer. Harper has copies of everything, including the IP address logs that trace directly to Morrison and Associates. Bev's face went from red to pale in about 2 seconds, and she looked at Joel desperately. But Joel just looked away because he'd apparently decided to stop enabling her lies, and the truth was settling over the room like heavy snow, cold and inescapable. My mother made one last attempt to salvage the situation, her voice breaking with what might have been genuine emotion for the first time, and she said, "Kara, please, can't we just work this out as a family? Think about Natalie's baby. Think about your future niece or nephew growing up without a stable home. Think about family legacy and staying connected, and not letting lawyers and legal threats tear us apart." And that's when Harper revealed the piece of information I'd asked her to save for maximum impact, pulling out another document from her folder and saying calmly, "Actually, let's talk about Kara's future, since that seems to be a concern. Kara is pre-approved for a mortgage through a first-time homebuyer program at her credit union. She'll be purchasing her own house within the next 60 days, and she won't be co-signing anything for anyone." The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave, like someone had set off a bomb in the middle of the table, and I watched their faces process the information in stages. My mother actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and Harold sat back in his chair heavily like he'd been pushed. Bev's expression went through rapid changes: shock, anger, disbelief, calculation, before settling into something cold and mean, and she said without thinking, the truth slipping out, "That's impossible. We made sure she couldn't qualify. We blocked every avenue. We ruined her credit score." The confession hung in the air, an admission she clearly hadn't meant to make, and Harper smiled without warmth and said, "You attempted to make sure she couldn't qualify. You failed. The fraudulent credit inquiries were identified and removed. Your identity theft was documented and reported to the police and the State Bar Association. And Kara's actual financial profile is strong enough for approval through a legitimate program designed for people exactly like her." She paused deliberately, then added almost conversationally, "I should also mention that we've uncovered substantial evidence of conspiracy to commit financial fraud involving multiple family members. And we have documentation of systematic financial exploitation, identity theft, and attempted coercion. If anyone in this room continues to interfere with Kara's finances, her credit, her son's involvement in gathering information, or her housing plans, we'll be pursuing both criminal charges and civil litigation for restitution of the $42,000 plus damages." The meeting fell apart after that, descended into chaos with my mother crying about how I was tearing the family apart over money, my father sitting in furious silence, Bev trying to argue that we were misinterpreting innocent family dynamics, Natalie crying quietly in a corner, looking genuinely devastated. Harper and I simply gathered our materials and walked out, and as we reached the door, my father's voice boomed across the room one last time. "If you walk out that door with that lawyer, you're not part of this family anymore, Kara. Don't expect any help from us ever again. Don't expect to be invited to holidays or celebrations. Don't expect us to be there when you fail and need someone to pick up the pieces." I turned back to look at him, this man who was supposed to be my father, who was supposed to want the best for me, and I said quietly, "Dad, you just tried to trick me into co-signing a $300,000 debt for a house I'll never live in. You stole $42,000 from me. You sabotaged my credit and manipulated my son. I haven't been part of this family for a long time, except as a resource to be exploited." And then Harper and I walked out into the late afternoon sunlight, and I felt something lift off my shoulders. Some weight I'd been carrying for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. We sat in Harper's car for a few minutes in my parents' driveway, both of us silent. And then she said, "How do you feel?" And I realized the answer was complicated. I felt sad and angry and relieved and terrified all at once, but underneath it all was something I hadn't felt in years. free, genuinely free from their control and their expectations and their narrative about who I was supposed to be. The house search began in earnest after that confrontation, with me pouring all my energy into looking at properties instead of processing family drama, because dwelling on what they'd done would only give them more power over my emotional state. I met with a real estate agent Gwen recommended, a woman named Patricia Rodriguez, who specialized in first-time buyers and understood the unique challenges of people working with tight budgets and no family support. Patricia was patient and knowledgeable, and never made me feel embarrassed about my budget constraints, and together we looked at properties all over town in my price range. Some were too small, basically glorified studios that wouldn't work with Brandon visiting half-time, and some needed too much work. Foundations crumbling and electrical systems from the 1940s that would cost tens of thousands to update. Some were in neighborhoods I didn't feel safe in, areas where car break-ins were common, and the schools were struggling, and I didn't want Brandon having to navigate that environment when he stayed with me. But Patricia kept searching and sending me listings, and after 3 weeks and probably 20 house tours, we found it on a quiet street on the east side of town. A small 2-bedroom bungalow built in 1952 with good bones and recent updates. The house had original hardwood floors that had been refinished, a new roof installed just 2 years ago, new double-pane windows that would save on heating costs, and a tidy fenced backyard with mature trees and a small patio. The kitchen was dated but functional. The bathroom had been updated in the last decade, and there was a detached garage that Brandon immediately claimed as potential workshop space when we toured it together. The house was listed at $206,000, right at the top of my range, but not impossible. And Patricia said the sellers were motivated because they'd already purchased another property and needed to close quickly. I made an offer that same evening, coming in at $200,000 with a request for the sellers to pay closing costs, which was aggressive, but Patricia said it was worth trying given their timeline pressure. 2 days later, that felt like 2 years. My phone rang with Patricia's number, and she said in a voice bright with genuine excitement, "Kara, they accepted your offer. If you can close in 30 days, the house is yours." I felt something break loose in my chest when I heard those words. Some tight, painful knot I'd been carrying for so long, I'd forgotten it was there. Forgotten what it felt like to breathe fully without that constriction. My hands were shaking when I hung up the phone, and I had to sit down because my legs suddenly wouldn't hold me. And I cried for the second time in this whole process. But this time, the tears were relief and joy and disbelief that this was actually happening, that I was actually going to own property, going to have equity and stability and something that was mine alone. The next 4 weeks were a blur of inspections and appraisals and paperwork. Mountains of forms to sign, an initial and date, coordinating schedules between my 2 jobs and the title company and the inspector and the appraiser. The inspection revealed minor issues, some old knob and tube wiring in the attic that should be replaced eventually, and a slow leak under the kitchen sink, but nothing deal-breaking, nothing that made me want to walk away. The appraisal came in exactly at my offer price, which Gwen said was perfect. Not leaving money on the table, but not overpaying either, and the underwriter approved my loan without any additional conditions, which apparently almost never happened, according to Gwen. Through all of this, I kept my family blocked on my phone, refusing to let their drama or their attempts to interfere penetrate the bubble of focus I'd built around this goal. Harper called midway through to tell me the State Bar Association had opened an investigation into Bev's conduct, and that Morrison and Associates had filed their own complaint about misuse of firm resources, which meant Bev would likely face serious professional consequences beyond just losing her job. Harper also said my parents had responded to the demand letter through their own attorney, claiming the money I'd sent them were gifts, not loans, and therefore not subject to repayment. But she had documentation of their promises to repay that would hold up in court if we needed to take it that far. I told Harper to keep pursuing it, because principle mattered, because they needed to face consequences for their exploitation, even if I never saw that money again. But my primary focus remained on closing on my house and moving forward with my life, rather than backward into their manipulation. The closing happened on a Thursday morning in late October. One of those perfect autumn days where the air is crisp and clear and leaves are turning brilliant colors on the back trees along the street where my new house stood waiting for me. I met Harper and Gwen at the title company office, both of them insisting on being there even though only Gwen was technically necessary for the transaction. And we sat in a conference room with the sellers, a pleasant retired couple moving to Arizona, and their agent, and the title company representative who would facilitate everything. There were stacks of papers to sign, my hand cramping slightly from the repetition of signatures and initials and dates, each page representing some aspect of this enormous commitment I was making, this mortgage that would be part of my life for the next 30 years. When the final signature was done and the title company representative slid the keys across the table to me, actual physical keys on a ring with a small house-shaped keychain, I had to blink back tears because this was real. This was actually happening despite everything my family had done to stop it. This was mine. Harper was smiling like she'd won something too, like this victory was personal for both of us, after all the battles we'd fought together. And she said quietly, so only I could hear, "You did this, Kara. You saved yourself when your family tried to keep you dependent. That takes more strength than most people have." After the closing, we drove to the house, the three of us caravanning over in our separate cars, and I stood on the front porch with the keys in my hand and Brandon beside me, having skipped school with his father's reluctant permission for this important moment, and I unlocked the door of my house for the first time as the actual owner. The sellers had left it clean and empty, ready for new occupants, and the afternoon sun came through the west-facing windows, making patterns on the refinished hardwood floors, and Brandon walked through the rooms with barely contained excitement, claiming his bedroom and already planning how he'd set it up with his computer and his books and his collection of vintage video games. I just stood in the living room, breathing in the smell of my own house, my own space, my own future that nobody could take away or give away or use as leverage against me. And the feeling was so overwhelming, I had to sit down on the floor for a minute. Gwen and Harper left after an hour, giving me and Brandon time alone to explore and dream. And as they drove away, Gwen called out her window, "Enjoy your home, Kara. You earned every square foot of it." Brandon and I spent the rest of that afternoon measuring rooms and planning furniture placement and talking about paint colors, even though I couldn't afford to paint yet. And he was more animated than I'd seen him in months. Like the stress of being caught between warring family factions had lifted now that the goal had been achieved. That evening, we picked up pizza and sat on the floor of my empty living room, eating straight from the box and talking about the future, about how his room would be set up, about whether I should get a dog now that I had a fenced yard, about how strange and wonderful it felt to own something this significant. I didn't tell my family immediately about the purchase, decided to let them find out through the small-town gossip network that inevitably reported on property transfers and mortgage filings, let them process it on their own time without giving them the opportunity to rain on my celebration. But 3 weeks after I'd moved my modest furniture in and hung curtains and started making the house feel like home, I decided it was time to tell them properly, to close this chapter with one final gathering on my terms in my space. I sent out invitations to a small housewarming dinner, keeping the wording simple and factual. "Please join me for dinner at my new home," with the address listed clearly and a date 2 weeks out, giving them time to process and decide whether to come. The invitation went to my parents, to Natalie and Austin, to Bev and Joel, though I expected Bev to decline given the legal situation, and to a handful of extended family members who'd been peripherally involved in the drama, cousins and aunts who'd heard one version of events and deserved to see the reality. Natalie called me immediately when she got the invitation, her voice confused and maybe a little awed when she said, "Kara, is this real? Did you really buy a house? I thought they said you'd never qualify, that your credit was too damaged." I told her yes, it was real, The closing had happened 3 weeks ago, and I'd been settling in, and there was a long silence before she said quietly, "Mom's gonna lose her mind when she sees this." She wasn't wrong about that prediction, and when the evening of the dinner arrived, my mother was the first to show up. 30 minutes early with Harold beside her, both of them looking grim and uncomfortable. Mom walked up to my front door with that tight smile that meant she was angry, but trying to hide it behind social conventions. And when I opened the door to let them in, she looked past me into the living room, like she was checking to make sure this wasn't some elaborate joke or trick. Natalie arrived next with Austin, her pregnancy just starting to show now at 4 months along, and she walked through my small house slowly, running her hand along the walls in the kitchen, looking out the window at my backyard, examining everything with an expression I couldn't quite read. Bev came despite everything, despite the cease and desist letter and the bar investigation and the fraud charges, probably unable to resist seeing for herself whether I'd really succeeded, and a few cousins and my Aunt Susan filled out the small gathering. They all stood in my living room, looking around at the house that represented everything they'd tried to prevent. This modest 2-bedroom bungalow that wasn't anything grand or impressive, but was mine, owned by me, in my name only, with a mortgage I'd qualified for, and payments I could afford without anyone's help. I watched my mother's face as she processed what she was seeing, watched her signature laugh from the barbecue die somewhere in her throat, as the reality settled over her that I'd succeeded despite their sabotage, that I'd bought a house while Natalie was struggling to keep hers, that the family hierarchy they'd worked so hard to maintain had been disrupted completely. Harold couldn't find words at all, his face going through complicated emotions while he tried to process that I'd actually done it, that I'd beaten their coordinated efforts to keep me in my assigned place, and I could see him recalculating everything he thought he knew about my capabilities and my resources. Natalie was the first to speak, walking back from her tour of the bedrooms with tears in her eyes, but smiling, really smiling, in a way that looked genuine rather than performative. And she said quietly so only I could hear, "It's perfect, Kara. It's really perfect. I'm proud of you for doing this despite everything, despite what we all did to try to stop you." We didn't have a big dramatic confrontation that night. No shouting or accusations or rehashing of all the betrayals and manipulations, because that wasn't the point of the gathering and would have just given them more ammunition to paint me as bitter and vengeful. The point was simply this: they'd laughed when my mother said I'd never have a house like Natalie's. They'd sabotaged my credit and stolen my money and tried to trap me in permanent dependency. They'd needed me to stay, small and struggling to maintain their family structure and their control over my life. But I'd bought a house anyway, not because of them, but despite them, in the face of their active opposition. My new address didn't just change where I lived or where my mail got delivered. It changed the entire power dynamic we'd operated under my whole life, shifted the balance from them having control over my financial future to me being independent of their approval or their interference. As they left that evening, making awkward goodbyes and vague promises to stay in touch that we all knew were hollow, I stood on my front porch with my house keys in my pocket and watched their cars pull away down the quiet street. And I felt something I hadn't felt since I was very young, something I'd almost forgotten was possible. Free, genuinely free to make my own choices and my own mistakes and build my own future without their narrative about my limitations constraining what I could achieve. The legal battles continued for months after that dinner, with Harper pursuing the $42,000 in stolen money and the State Bar Association proceeding with their investigation of Bev's conduct. But those became background noise to the life I was building in my small house on the east side of town. I painted Brandon's room the blue he wanted. I planted flowers in the backyard. I fixed the slow leak under the kitchen sink myself, with help from YouTube tutorials. And every mortgage payment I made felt like another brick in a wall, protecting me from ever being that vulnerable to family manipulation again. Sometimes late at night, I'd sit on my back patio and think about everything that had happened, about the barbecue comment that had started this whole fight, about the $42,000 I'd unknowingly spent funding Natalie's dream while mine was mocked, about Brandon being used as a spy and Bev committing felonies from her law firm computer, and I'd feel angry all over again at the sheer scope of the betrayal. But then I'd look at my house, at the windows glowing warm with light from inside, at the fence I'd repaired and the garden I'd planted and the roof that was mine to maintain, and the anger would fade into something more like pity for people so insecure in their own positions that they had to sabotage someone else's success to feel valid. Harper eventually won a judgment for $30,000 of the $42,000 I'd sent my parents, the rest being difficult to prove as loans rather than gifts, because I'd been too trusting to get written agreements. But even that partial victory felt satisfying, felt like official recognition that what they'd done was wrong and actionable. Bev lost her paralegal license permanently and faced probation for the fraud charges, her legal career destroyed by her attempt to destroy mine. And while I didn't take pleasure in her suffering, I didn't feel guilty about it either, because actions have consequences, and she'd chosen her actions knowing they were wrong. Natalie eventually sold her house at a loss and moved into a modest rental with Austin, downsizing dramatically and apparently working on her marriage and her relationship with money. And she sent me a card 6 months after my housewarming dinner with a simple message. "Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. I'm learning." We don't have a close relationship now and probably never will. Too much has happened for us to go back to being sisters in any meaningful way, but we have a cordial distance that feels healthier than the forced closeness we pretended to have before. My parents and I haven't spoken since the housewarming dinner. Their pride and their narrative about family loyalty preventing them from acknowledging what they did or apologizing for it. And I've made peace with that loss, because you can't have a real relationship with people who see you as a resource rather than a person. If you've ever been the responsible one they used and mocked, the daughter who gave everything while receiving only criticism and sabotage, the person who had to buy their own victory because family wouldn't give it to you, or worse, actively tried to prevent it, then you understand what this house means to me, beyond just shelter and investment. It means I proved them wrong about my limitations, proved that their laughter was always about their own fear and insecurity, rather than any real assessment of my capabilities. It means I broke free from a family system designed to keep me in a supporting role while someone else got the spotlight and the support. It means I taught my son that boundaries aren't cruelty and independence isn't betrayal, that sometimes the people who are supposed to support you are the ones you need to protect yourself from most. And it means that success doesn't always look like winning their approval or changing their minds about your worth. Sometimes it looks like building something solid and real despite their opposition, something they can't take away or diminish, no matter how hard they try. My small house on a quiet street isn't impressive by most standards, isn't the kind of place that gets featured in magazines or makes people gasp with envy, but it's mine, in a way nothing else in my life has ever been mine, and that makes it worth more than any mansion could ever be. So if this story resonated with you, if you've ever had family members try to keep you small or sabotage your dreams or use you financially while mocking your aspirations, I want you to know that you're not crazy for feeling hurt by it. You're not selfish for wanting independence from people who exploit you. And you're not obligated to keep funding someone else's lifestyle while your own dreams get dismissed as unrealistic. You're allowed to protect yourself, even from family. Allowed to establish boundaries, even when they call it betrayal. Allowed to pursue your goals, even when the people who should support you actively work against you. And if you succeed, despite their opposition, if you build something real and solid that they can't control or take credit for, that's not revenge or pettiness, that's justice. That's survival. That's you reclaiming your own life from people who thought they had the right to write your story for you. My parents laughed and said I'd never have a house like my sister's. And they were right in a way they didn't intend. I don't have a house like Natalie's, built on family money, and co-signed loans and financial support I never received. I have something better, a house I bought myself with money I earned through obstacles I overcame that nobody can ever take away or claim credit for. And that makes every single square foot of it worth more than any mansion could ever be worth to me. That's the real story, the one they'll never understand or acknowledge. And I'm okay with that, because their understanding isn't required for my success to be real and valid and worth celebrating. If you're listening from somewhere in the world where family pressure and expectations and financial manipulation feel overwhelming and inescapable, I hope this story gives you permission to fight back, to document everything, to get legal help if needed, to protect yourself and your future, even when it means breaking the silence and accepting that some relationships can't be salvaged. And if you're already free, already built your own version of my small house, already proved them wrong about your limitations, then you know exactly what this victory feels like and why it matters so much beyond just the property and the equity and the mortgage payments. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's being told they're selfish for wanting independence or unrealistic for having dreams that their family won't support. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is show each other that escape is possible and success is achievable, even when the people who should help us are the ones standing in our way.